I went from 1400 to 2100 in just 60 days, and I'm gonna tell you how I did it. So you can do the same thing. The one thing I focused on were the weaknesses. A weakness is a square that is attacked more times than it is defended. And with that in mind, let's go into the first game. Alright, so for the first game, we are facing a King's Indian defense. Now we go pawn to e3 instead of pawn to e4, which is usually what is most played by everyone. But I feel more comfortable in these positions, so I go pawn to e3. Now my opponent castles, and I want to castle as well, so I bring my pieces out, I castle, pawn to e5, and I go pawn to d5, attacking the knight on c6. He goes knight to b4, and just gives me a chance to attack it once again, pawn to a3, and he has to go back to a6. And now I go queen to c2, preventing the pawn push on e4, because I would take that. And now he goes bishop to f5, attacking my queen. Now I go pawn to e4, making the bishop go back to d7, and I go pawn to h3, preventing a very annoying pin on g4, so you don't bother my very beautiful knight on f3. Now he goes knight to c5, putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn on e4. However, the pawn is defended 2 times, so there's nothing to worry about. I go pawn to b4, attacking the knight. Once again, I have not stopped attacking that knight. Poor knight. He goes back to a6 now, and I develop my bishop, connecting my rooks and finishing my development, my opening. Now he goes pawn to c6, and I put the rook on an x-ray with the queen on d8. Now he takes the pawn on d5, and I take a long time here thinking what to take with. Every single take is fine, you can take with anything. However, you have a little bit of a weakness on d6, so I don't want to have a pawn right here blocking the way of the weakness. So I take with the knight. He goes bishop to c6, and that is a blunder, because I could go pawn to b5, and that is a fork, attacking the knight and the bishop at the same time. However, if I do that now, he can just get rid of the bishop by taking my knight. So first, I get rid of my knight by taking his knight first with a check, so you have to take care of that. And when he takes back, I can now go pawn to b5, winning one of the pieces. He goes knight c7. Of course, I take the bishop now. He takes back, and now I want to attack the weakness on d6. So I go queen to d2. He gets rid of the weakness by pushing. Of course, that's just a free pawn. However, he goes pawn to e4, and he wins back the pawn. But it doesn't matter, I'm still up 1 piece. So it's just a matter of exchanging absolutely everything. Queen d6, I attack the queen. He gives me a chance to take the bishop. Of course, I do that. Attack the queen again. Ask for a queen trade. Now I go knight d4, attacking his queen, and then he goes knight d5, attacking my queen. But of course, we can just exchange absolutely everything. At the end, I have 2 rooks. He has 2 rooks, but I have 1 bishop, so we are up a piece. Of course, I bring my rooks to the 7th rank to end the game very easily. Both of the rooks are now in the 7th rank. We just exchange absolutely everything, and I push the a pawn until a6, so that is defended by the bishop. Then he goes to attack the pawn, but I just bring my king, attack the e-pawn, and he realizes he can't do anything to defend those pawns, and he resigns the game. And now we move on to the second game. And now in the second game, my opponent goes pawn to h4. I don't know what that is. I don't know that opening, but I just develop my pieces. Very normal. I just push the pawns, gain some space in the center. Knight to c3, I go d4, gaining a lot more space. He goes back with the knight, and look at this. All his pieces are in the back rank. I just keep developing, gaining some space. Pawn to c5. He attacks the pawn on e5, so I defend it with the knight. And now he goes bishop to e2. I go h6, just preventing a very annoying pin on g5. Then he goes knight bd2, and I just keep expanding. He goes a3 to prevent a very easy pawn to b4, but I can still go b4. I just develop my bishop. He castles, and I want to castle as well. He goes a4 now, wasting another tempo with the pawn. I just go a6. If you take, and then take my rook. The rook is defended by the queen, so there's no problem about that. Now he goes pawn to c3, and at this point I'm looking for some tactics or weaknesses in his position. For example, the pawn on h4 is only defended by the knight on f3, and if I move my knight away, attacking the pawn twice, well, he can just go g3, and I just wasted a move for nothing. So I was looking for knight takes e4. Knight takes e4, and if he takes with the pawn, then I go d3, winning the bishop. However, if knight takes e4, he can just take with the knight, and that is not good. I just lost a piece. So I just settle for castling for this point. He takes on d4, I take back with the pawn to open up the c file for my rook. We have b3, he wants to develop the bishop via b2 or maybe a3 at some point. I bring my queen out, bishop b2, and now I bring my rook into the open file. Now he goes knight to h2, maybe with the idea of going pawn to f4, breaking things up. So I go bishop to d6, preventing that, and he goes knight g4, he wants some exchanges. I'm not really interested at this point, so I just go knight to b4 with the idea of bringing my rook onto c2 and doubling up on the c file. He takes on f6 first, that is a check, so I have to take back, and now he brings his bishop out to g4, asking for a lot more exchanges, but the bishop is not defending the pawn anymore, so I just take it. And then he takes on e6, I take back, and queen to g4 check, attacking the pawn on e6 at the same time. So I go king to f7, defending the pawn, queen to h5, now attacking the pawn on h6, so I go king g7. Now he attacks my queen, I go back, and then he goes bishop to c1. And I really don't like this idea of the queen and the bishop both pointing at the pawn on h6, so I just take the bishop first. He takes back with the rook, I go queen to f7 asking for some exchanges now. He goes queen to g4 check. If I block with the queen, he can just take the pawn on e6. So I don't like that, so I just move the king out of the way. He takes and I take, and he goes pawn to f4, and I get a little bit too greedy here, a little bit too aggressive. I go pawn to f5 attacking the queen. Now he takes back the pawn on f5, I take back, and he just takes the pawn on e5, ignoring the attack on his queen, because if I take the queen, which is what I did, I can drop my queen. This is what happened in the game, and now I want to attack the rook. How would you attack the rook? If you say king to g6, that is a blunder, because they have rook to f6 with a check and winning the bishop next. So instead I went king to g8, he pushed the pawn to protect the rook, and now notice that the king can go to h2 because of the bishop on d6. So at this point I can just go rook to c1 check. If he blocks with any of the pieces, that's good for me. He's retrieving pieces, I like that. But if he goes king to f2, I can just pin the knight. If he walks out of the pin, I can just pin it again. And now look at all this pressure, he has to go back. Now his pieces are very passive and I'm winning here. But instead in the game, I got way too hungry. I got too greedy. I went to attack the pawn on a5 and attack the knight at the same time. And this is a horrible move by me because I'm allowing knight to e4 and knight to f6 next. It is impossible to stop that. Knight to f6 is deadly because that's a check first of all. And then when I move to h7, he has rook to h7 and that is checkmate. So how do I even stop that? I go rook to c1 check and I start giving checks all over the place, but I kind of make things even worse because I bring the king into the attack. And now he's following up by knight to f6 and rook to h7 at this point. It's just impossible to stop. That's gonna be checkmate, so unfortunately I resigned this game. But I learned something. Don't get too greedy. Look for your opponent's threats as well, not just yours. There are two people playing. And now we move on to the third game. Now for the third game we have a Sicilian with an Alpine variation. You wanna gain some space in the center? Well, pawn to d5, I'm gaining some space first. He takes back with the pawn, I take with the queen, pawn to d4, and I go pawn to e6, over protecting the pawn on c5. He develops his pieces, I develop mine, he wants to castle. Before I castle, I take the pawn on d4, he takes back, and now I castle. He goes knight to c3, attacking my queen. Of course, I just drop the queen back, and bishop to g5. Knight to d6, putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn on d4. He goes bishop to c2 first, and pawn to b6, of course, to develop this bishop via b7 or via a6. Now he goes queen to d3, and he wants to win this knight for free. What does this move have to do with this knight? Well, if I do something very stupid here, for example a5 or who knows what, he can just take this knight for free. But what do you mean for free if we can just take back? Well, that would be at the cost of checkmate. You know, the knight on f6 was defending h7 and it is gone now. So instead of doing something stupid, I went knight to b4 with a fork, forking the queen and the bishop. And he picked the worst square in the world. He went queen to e2. And then before taking the bishop, when you find a good move, you try to find something better. There's always something better. Now I go bishop to a6, pinning the queen to the rook. If you move the queen, you lose this rook. And now he went knight to b5, blocking the way of the bishop. And now we have two options. I could take the knight, and when he takes back, now the queen is not defending the bishop anymore, I can just take it. Or we can do what I did in the game, just take the bishop on c2 first. And my opponent just resigned. Because when you take back, I'll just take the knight on b5, attacking the rook, and this is just game over. Focus on the weaknesses. You will get a lot more points than if you just do tactics all day. Part 7 is coming up tomorrow. You don't want to miss it. So subscribe and turn on the notifications. And I will see you in the next game.